Tonight, you're marching inside one of the worst military disasters in European history, and you don't even know it yet. More than 400,000 men crossed the Niemen in the first Great Wave back in June, while additional armies and reinforcements brought the wider invasion force far higher. It was the largest army Europe had yet seen, assembled by a commander who had dominated the continent for more than a decade. Nobody marching beside you in those first confident weeks seriously considered the possibility of failure. Why would they? This army seemed built to win. By the time this is over, only a fraction of those who entered Russia will return in organized ranks. You don't know that outcome yet. Right now, you only know Moscow, the city you were promised would end this war, and the fire you found waiting there instead. Not a battle, not a surrender. A nearly empty city consumed by flames whose precise origins historians would continue to debate, though Russian preparations and deliberate fires clearly played a role. You waited 5 weeks in those ashes for a peace offer that never arrived. Now you're marching again, except backward, retracing hundreds of miles of already stripped countryside as supplies fail and winter closes in. Here's what you don't know yet, walking beside you tonight, that history already knows. You don't know about the river crossing 3 weeks from now, where thousands will die, drown, freeze, or disappear amid artillery fire and panic. You don't know how quickly cold can numb exposed skin, weaken an exhausted body, and turn a brief halt beside the road into a final sleep. You don't know which of the men marching beside you right now, joking, complaining, sharing what little food remains, will still be walking in 6 weeks, and which will simply stop, sit down at the roadside, and never stand back up. Tonight, you're going to discover how an army this large, confident, and recently dominant was reduced to a remnant not by one decisive battle alone, but by Russian resistance, distance, hunger, disease, collapsing logistics, and cold. You remember, even now, marching away from it, exactly what Moscow looked like on that first night the fires properly took hold. The city had seemed, for those first few hours after your army finally entered it in September, remarkably intact, remarkably empty, most of its residents having fled in the days before your arrival, leaving behind a strange, hollow victory. Then the fires started, first as isolated points of light scattered across the skyline, easy enough to dismiss as accidents. Soon, entire districts were burning at once, the flames racing through a city built largely from wood. Moscow's governor, Fyodor Rostopchin, had removed or disabled much of the city's firefighting equipment before the French arrived. French witnesses also reported capturing Russian incendiaries, while later historians argued that looting, cooking fires, wind, and the absence of an effective fire brigade helped separate blazes become a citywide disaster. The full responsibility remains disputed. Whatever its precise cause, the result was unmistakable. You remember grand buildings collapsing into flame and ash, and your commander's visible frustration as his hoped-for prize burned around the soldiers meant to occupy it. Much of Moscow was destroyed before the fires exhausted themselves. What remained was ash, rubble, and scattered stone buildings, strong enough to resist the flames. You didn't know it then, but that fire was the first genuine sign that this campaign's ending would look nothing like the confident victory everyone had expected back in June. Before any of this, before Moscow, before the burning and the waiting and everything that followed, there was the crossing itself, back in June, an image you find yourself returning to now, with an aching clarity given everything you now know followed it. The Niemen River marked the border between friendly territory and Russia proper, and your army's crossing of it represented, at the time, one of the most impressive military spectacles you'd personally ever witnessed. Bridges of boats stretched across the water, columns of soldiers stretching back for miles. The sheer scale of this assembled force feeling in that confident summer moment, unstoppable. You remember the mood among your fellow soldiers during this crossing distinctly. Confidence bordering on outright celebration. Veteran soldiers who'd fought across a decade of successful campaigns, treating this Russian venture as simply the next inevitable triumph. Your commander himself reportedly watched this crossing with evident satisfaction. This massive, multinational force representing the practical culmination of years of careful political and military preparation. Nobody crossing that river in June could have reasonably anticipated exactly how catastrophically this campaign would eventually conclude. The confident soldiers marching across those bridges, yourself included, believed in swift victory. You think about that crossing now, from your current vantage point of hard-won, brutal knowledge, feeling a complicated mixture of nostalgia for that lost confidence and grim recognition of exactly how thoroughly circumstances would eventually prove that confidence catastrophically, tragically misplaced. For over a month after Moscow's fires finally settled, your army simply waited, occupying whatever shelter the surviving buildings offered, hoping that Tsar Alexander would eventually send terms of surrender the way every other defeated power had done before him. That surrender never came. Alexander, safely distant from the burned capital, apparently calculated correctly that time itself, combined with Russia's brutal approaching winter, would accomplish what his own battered armies hadn't yet managed to achieve through direct combat. You spent those 5 weeks in increasingly uncomfortable idleness, watching supplies dwindle as your army consumed whatever remained in Moscow's surviving storehouses without any meaningful resupply arriving from the increasingly distant, increasingly vulnerable supply lines stretching back toward friendlier territory. Your commander, reportedly, grew increasingly frustrated during these weeks, sending repeated messages toward St. Petersburg proposing various peace terms. Each message met with silence rather than the negotiation he'd clearly anticipated. This was not how his previous campaigns had concluded. By mid-October, with winter's first genuine warning signs already appearing, the decision was finally reluctantly made. The army would withdraw from Moscow, retreating toward friendlier territory before winter made that withdrawal more dangerous than it already promised to be. You remember the mixture of relief and dread that decision produced among the ordinary soldiers around you. Relief at finally moving again after weeks of uncomfortable waiting. Dread at the growing recognition that this retreat was beginning later in the year than anyone comfortable with Russian winters would have advised. When your army finally departed Moscow in mid-October, a genuine strategic argument unfolded about exactly which route the retreat should follow, a decision that would prove far more consequential than most ordinary soldiers marching in the ranks fully appreciated at the time. Your commander initially favored a southern route through regions that hadn't already been stripped bare of food and forage during the army's earlier advance toward Moscow. A battle near Maloyaroslavets, fought as your army attempted exactly this southern route, ended tactically ambiguous but strategically decisive. Russian forces demonstrated enough continued strength and positioning that continuing southward risked forcing a larger, potentially catastrophic confrontation your already weakened army could ill afford. The decision was made, reluctantly, to retreat instead along the same northern route you'd originally advanced upon back in the summer. The same road already thoroughly stripped of food, forage, and shelter by your own army's earlier passage months before. You didn't fully understand, marching along this familiar but devastated road, exactly how significant this routing decision would prove. You simply understood, day by day, that villages you remembered passing through with reasonable supplies back in the summer now stood empty and stripped bare. The ground beneath your boots was, in the most literal sense, already consumed. Whatever this retreat would need to survive on, it wouldn't be finding it along this 600-mile stretch of already exhausted Russian countryside. It's worth understanding, marching now among your fellow soldiers, exactly how remarkably diverse this army was, a detail that would matter as circumstances grew more desperate and unified command grew correspondingly more difficult to maintain. Barely half the men who'd crossed into Russia back in June were French. The remainder came from across practically every territory currently under French influence or alliance. Polish lancers fighting partly for hope of restored national independence, German states contributing substantial contingents, Italian, Dutch, Swiss, Portuguese, and Spanish troops, alongside Austrian and Prussian forces serving as reluctant, semi-cooperative allies. This diversity had seemed, during the confident advance toward Moscow, simply a testament to your commander's continental influence. It would prove, during the increasingly desperate retreat, a significant additional strain, different national contingents holding different levels of genuine loyalty to a cause increasingly divorced from their own specific national interests. Communication itself grew complicated across so many different languages and command traditions, orders requiring translation through multiple intermediary officers, coordination becoming increasingly difficult as discipline itself began fraying, under mounting pressure from cold, hunger, and constant harassment from pursuing Russian forces. You marched among Poles, Germans, Italians, and men from a dozen other territories, each carrying their own motivations for having joined this campaign in the first place. Each now facing the same brutal, indifferent Russian winter, regardless of whatever nationality had brought them here. Shared catastrophe, you were beginning to learn, has its own way of erasing whatever differences seemed significant back when everyone still expected this campaign to end in comfortable, celebrated victory. Understanding this campaign's catastrophic outcome requires appreciating exactly how fundamentally your army's entire supply system had been designed around assumptions that Russia's vast scale and limited road infrastructure would eventually prove catastrophically inadequate to support. Your commander's previous campaigns across more densely populated, more thoroughly developed regions of Western and Central Europe had relied heavily on living off local resources armies typically finding sufficient food and supplies within conquered or occupied territory to sustain operations without requiring the kind of extensive, vulnerable supply lines that campaigns in less developed regions demanded. Russia's vast distances and comparatively sparse agricultural development meant this established approach, successful in previous campaigns, proved inadequate here. The countryside simply unable to support an army this size through local requisition alone, particularly once your own army's substantial consumption during the advance had already significantly depleted whatever local resources initially existed. Supply wagons, intended to compensate for this inadequate local resourcing, proved themselves insufficient, both in absolute numbers relative to your army's substantial size and in their basic capacity to navigate Russia's poor road infrastructure, particularly once autumn rains and eventually snow made already difficult roads more treacherous for heavy wagon traffic. You witnessed, throughout this campaign's various stages, the practical consequences of this fundamental supply failure: hunger and inadequate provisioning, representing constant background concern, even during the campaign's earlier, more confident stages, well before the retreat's additional catastrophic demands compounded this existing systemic weakness into genuine widespread crisis. This supply failure, considered now with whatever clarity subsequent reflection provides, represented perhaps this entire campaign's most fundamental strategic miscalculation, an assumption that previous European campaigning experience would translate successfully into Russia's different logistical environment. An assumption that proved ultimately catastrophically incorrect, regardless of whatever tactical or leadership qualities your army otherwise possessed. Almost from the moment your retreat properly began, a persistent, unsettling presence made itself known along your army's flanks and rear. Cossack cavalry, appearing and disappearing along the tree line with a fluid, mobile menace that felt entirely different from the formal, set-piece battles your army had trained and prepared for. These weren't regular Russian army units, fighting according to familiar European military conventions. Cossacks operated as light, highly mobile cavalry, striking at vulnerable stragglers, isolated foraging parties, and poorly defended supply wagons, then vanishing back into forest or open steppe before any organized response could properly engage them. Their presence created a constant, low-level psychological pressure beyond whatever direct physical casualties they inflicted. A persistent awareness that falling behind the main column or wandering too far in search of food could mean sudden, violent death or capture, rather than merely additional hardship. You learn to watch the tree line yourself during marching hours. Learn to recognize the quality of movement that indicated genuine cavalry presence, rather than simply wind moving through bare branches. Regular Russian army forces, meanwhile, generally avoided large-scale direct confrontation during much of this retreat, apparently content to let winter, hunger, and this persistent, harassing pressure accomplish their strategic goals without requiring the same costly, direct combat that had characterized earlier battles. This represented, in its own way, a particularly demoralizing kind of warfare, an enemy content to simply watch you slowly destroy yourselves through cold and starvation, occasionally accelerating that process through swift, opportunistic strikes. Food, or rather its increasingly desperate absence, dominated practically every waking thought during this retreat's early weeks, a concern that grew more acute each day. As your army retraced ground its own earlier advance had already thoroughly exhausted. Foraging parties, sent out daily to search nearby villages and countryside for anything edible, returned with diminishing success as October wore on, finding villages already stripped bare, either by your own army's earlier passage or by retreating Russian forces employing their own deliberate, scorched earth tactics. You learned quickly which foods this desperate situation eventually made acceptable that you'd never have considered back home. Horse meat, initially avoided out of simple cultural reluctance, gradually became not merely acceptable but valuable, particularly once your army's horses themselves began dying from exhaustion, cold, and their own severe lack of adequate forage. Rationing became increasingly theoretical rather than enforceable, official supply distribution breaking down, as centralized command structure itself began fraying under the mounting pressure of maintaining organization across an army stretched thin along hundreds of miles of increasingly desperate, disorganized retreat. Individual soldiers and smaller groups increasingly fended for themselves, sharing food only within immediate, trusted circles of comrades, rather than any broader, organized distribution system. You remember specific, vivid hunger from these weeks, a persistent physical sensation that eventually became simply your body's constant baseline state rather than any acute, temporary discomfort. Medical care throughout this campaign relied on field hospitals that proved, from relatively early stages, inadequate to handle the sheer volume of casualties. This campaign's combination of combat, disease, and eventually severe cold would ultimately generate. Surgeons worked under primitive conditions by any modern medical standard, limited anesthesia, limited understanding of infection prevention, and severely limited supplies, all combining to make even straightforward medical interventions more dangerous and less reliably successful than contemporary medical care would eventually achieve. You witnessed or heard detailed accounts from those who directly witnessed field hospital conditions that would seem almost unimaginably difficult from any modern medical perspective. Wounded and sick soldiers crowded together in whatever shelter remained available, medical staff attempting to prioritize limited resources across overwhelming demand that simply exceeded their genuine capacity to properly address. Amputation, when required, proceeded without modern anesthesia beyond perhaps alcohol or opium when available. Surgeons working quickly, given the genuine agony their patients experienced, speed itself becoming a kind of crude mercy, given the alternative of prolonged suffering during necessarily lengthy procedures. Survival rates from serious wounds or illness remained poor by modern standards, infection claiming many patients who'd otherwise survived their initial combat wounds or illness. Medical understanding of this period simply lacking the germ theory and antiseptic practice that later medical advancement would eventually develop. You think, having witnessed this medical system's genuine limitations directly, about how differently this campaign's casualties might have fared with even modest modern medical intervention, a reflection that carries its own weight given how many comrades' deaths, in retrospect, resulted as much from inadequate period medical capability as from the direct combat or environmental circumstances that initially caused their wounds or illness. Alongside cold and hunger, a third threat followed your army throughout the campaign: infectious disease. Dysentery and several forms of fever had already weakened the ranks before the retreat began, spreading rapidly through crowded camps where clean water, washing, and fresh clothing were scarce. You watched soldiers fall ill with high fever, severe pain, confusion, dehydration, and growing weakness. Some illnesses were carried by lice, others spread through contaminated food and water. Modern research has identified evidence of louse-borne relapsing fever and paratyphoid among soldiers from the campaign, while historical accounts describe a broader mixture of epidemic disease. Doctors of the period could ease little beyond the most basic symptoms. They did not yet understand bacteria, insect vectors, or modern sanitation, and they had no antibiotics. A strong soldier could therefore survive battle, only to be defeated days later by an illness no one around him could properly identify. You remember the fear disease created among the men, an enemy that couldn't be seen, anticipated, or fought through courage alone. Among the earliest and most significant losses during this retreat's opening weeks were the horses themselves, animals whose deaths would prove more strategically catastrophic than their initial, individual losses might have suggested to soldiers watching them fall. Horses required more forage than the countryside could currently provide, and their condition deteriorated rapidly once adequate feed became unavailable, animals growing visibly weaker day by day until they simply collapsed in their traces, unable to continue pulling the artillery pieces, supply wagons, and looted valuables. Your army was still, somewhat absurdly, attempting to transport across this increasingly desperate retreat. Each dead horse represented multiple simultaneous crises: the loss of transport capacity for artillery and supplies, the loss of cavalry capability at exactly the moment. Persistent Cossack harassment made cavalry support increasingly valuable, and, with grim practicality, the sudden availability of meat that hungry soldiers rapidly learned to properly appreciate. You watched artillery pieces abandoned along the roadside with increasing frequency as October progressed, their draft horses too weakened or too thoroughly dead to continue hauling this heavy, valuable equipment any further. Cavalry units, meanwhile, found themselves increasingly dismounted as their own horses succumbed to the same brutal combination of inadequate forage and mounting exhaustion. Experienced cavalrymen reduced to marching alongside infantry. This slow, grinding loss of horses represented, in miniature, the broader catastrophe unfolding across your entire army. Capability and organization steadily eroding not through any single dramatic defeat, but through countless individual losses accumulating relentlessly, day after difficult day. Your own equipment, carried faithfully since this campaign's confident beginning, had gradually transformed from useful military necessity into an increasingly unbearable burden, forcing difficult choices about exactly what mattered enough to keep carrying across this exhausting, seemingly endless retreat. A soldier's standard kit included musket, ammunition, bayonet, several days' rations when available, spare clothing, and various personal items accumulated across months of campaigning. Weight that had seemed entirely manageable back when adequate food and rest kept your body strong enough to carry it. Now, weakened by persistent hunger and accumulating exhaustion, that same equipment felt heavier, forcing increasingly difficult calculations about what to abandon along the roadside in exchange for marginally easier movement. You watched fellow soldiers and eventually made these same difficult choices yourself, gradually shedding weight in whatever priority order seemed most sensible given immediate circumstances. Spare clothing first. Despite the obvious future risk this posed, once temperatures dropped further, then personal keepsakes and small valuables. The road behind your marching column grew increasingly littered with this accumulating discarded equipment. A visible physical record of your army's steadily deteriorating condition. You held onto your own weapon longer than many others around you, some stubborn combination of training, pride, and genuine practical awareness that unarmed men faced worse odds should Cossack cavalry suddenly appear demanding more than simple harassment from the tree line. Among this retreat's most visible, most symbolically significant losses were the artillery pieces themselves, sophisticated, valuable weapons that had represented genuine military advantage during this campaign's earlier confident stages, but became, during the retreat's mounting desperation, increasingly impossible burdens. Your diminishing forces simply couldn't continue adequately transporting. You witnessed cannon after cannon abandoned along the retreat's difficult route, their draft horses dead or too weakened to continue, crews too exhausted or too diminished in number to manually manage this heavy equipment's continued transport across increasingly difficult terrain and worsening weather conditions. Each abandoned cannon represented genuine military capability permanently surrendered, artillery that had provided crucial advantage during this campaign's earlier battles, now simply left for advancing Russian forces to eventually recover, a tangible, visible measure of your army's steadily diminishing combat effectiveness that no amount of remaining soldier, courage, or determination could adequately compensate for. Some units attempted, initially, to spike abandoned cannon, disabling their firing mechanisms to prevent Russian forces from simply recovering and reusing this valuable equipment against your own retreating army. This practice, however, required time and effort your increasingly desperate circumstances made progressively difficult to consistently maintain. Many cannon eventually abandoned without even this basic precautionary measure. You remember specific moments watching cannon crews, men you'd perhaps interacted with during this campaign's earlier stages, finally accepting their equipment's abandonment, a moment that carried genuine emotional weight beyond simple tactical calculation. These crews, having invested considerable pride and effort maintaining and effectively operating this sophisticated equipment throughout months of difficult campaigning. By the time your remaining forces finally reached genuine safety, the vast majority of artillery that had crossed into Russia with such confidence back in June remained scattered across hundreds of miles of Russian countryside, a permanent, visible testament to exactly how thoroughly this campaign's logistics had ultimately failed to support your army's continued combat effectiveness. The first hard frost arrived earlier than your commanders had apparently planned for, temperatures dropping sharply enough overnight that soldiers woke to find water frozen solid in their canteens. You remember that first truly cold morning distinctly. The shock of cold that seemed to penetrate straight through clothing never designed for genuine Russian winter conditions. Uniforms and equipment intended for more temperate European campaigning, now revealing themselves as dangerously inadequate. Frost formed on beards and eyebrows within hours of marching, breath crystallizing visibly in air, cold enough to make each inhalation feel sharp and deliberate. Fingers grew numb around musket stocks, feet ached inside boots, never intended for this kind of sustained, severe cold exposure. This first hard frost served as an unmistakable warning of worse conditions still to come, a preview that should have prompted more urgent preparation than your army's already stretched logistics and organization proved capable of delivering. You adapted as best you could, layering whatever clothing remained available, learning quickly which exposed skin required most urgent protection, developing the hunched, protective posture that would become universal among your fellow soldiers. Nobody around you spoke much about what this early, severe frost meant for the weeks still ahead. Nobody needed to. Somewhere, in the exhausted collective imagination of your retreating army, the city of Smolensk had become something close to a genuine promised land, a place where established supply depots supposedly waited, stockpiled, specifically to support exactly this kind of difficult retreat. You'd passed through Smolensk during the advance months earlier, remembered it as a substantial, defensible position, precisely the kind of location where sensible military planning would establish exactly the reserve supplies. Your increasingly desperate army now needed more urgently than almost anything else imaginable. The march towards Smolensk became, for many exhausted soldiers, including yourself, less a strategic military movement and more a kind of desperate pilgrimage. Each difficult day's progress, measured primarily by how much closer it brought you toward supplies and shelter, that surely everyone told themselves must be waiting there in adequate quantity. This hope sustained considerable morale during some of the retreat's most physically difficult stretches, soldiers pushing through genuine exhaustion, partly through simple, practical calculation that reaching Smolensk would finally, meaningfully improve their increasingly desperate circumstances. You marched with this hope yourself, rationing your own dwindling supplies, partly based on rough mental calculation of exactly how many more difficult days separated you from Smolensk's promised relief. The actual reality awaiting your army at Smolensk would prove, as you were about to discover, more complicated and more disappointing than this sustaining, desperate hope had allowed most exhausted soldiers to properly anticipate. When your army finally reached Smolensk in early November, after weeks of increasingly difficult marching through worsening cold and persistent Cossack harassment, the supplies waiting there proved devastatingly, catastrophically inadequate compared to what desperate hope had led most soldiers to expect. Some food and equipment had indeed been stockpiled, but nowhere near sufficient quantity to properly supply an army this size, an army whose numbers, though already significantly diminished, still represented a larger force than these limited supplies had ever been adequately calculated to support. Distribution itself broke down badly amid the desperate crush of soldiers, all simultaneously seeking whatever limited supplies existed. Organized military discipline giving way, in many documented instances, to something closer to chaotic scrambling. You witnessed, or perhaps directly experienced yourself, the bitter disappointment of finally reaching this long-hoped-for destination only to discover its actual, practical inadequacy. Hope that had sustained considerable physical effort now replaced by a different, more hollow kind of despair. Some units, better organized or simply more fortunate in their timing, managed to secure useful supplies during Smolensk's brief respite. Many others found remaining stocks already exhausted, gaining little practical benefit from this exhausting detour. Your commander, according to subsequent accounts, recognized quickly that Smolensk couldn't serve as the secure winter base some had originally hoped it might become, ordering the retreat to continue rather than risk his already weakened army attempting to defend a position that couldn't realistically sustain it. You left Smolensk within days, disappointment mixing uneasily with renewed, urgent awareness that whatever safety awaited your army still lay further along this same difficult, increasingly deadly road. By the time your army departed Smolensk, continuing its difficult retreat toward increasingly uncertain safety, the formal military discipline that had characterized this campaign's confident beginning had visibly, significantly deteriorated across large portions of the marching column. Units that had once maintained proper formation, responding promptly to officers' commands with the crisp efficiency your training had instilled, increasingly resembled loose, straggling crowds, individual survival instinct gradually overtaking formal military structure. Officers themselves suffered the same brutal conditions as ordinary soldiers, their authority increasingly difficult to maintain when they could offer no meaningful solution to the fundamental problems of inadequate food, inadequate shelter, and Russia's relentlessly worsening winter conditions. You notice this breakdown gradually rather than suddenly. Small individual decisions to fall slightly behind proper formation, to prioritize personal survival over strict adherence to command structure, accumulating across thousands of individual soldiers. Some units, generally those with particularly strong officers or particularly cohesive internal loyalty, maintained better discipline throughout this entire ordeal, a distinction that would prove significantly important during the various combat encounters still awaiting your army. You found yourself gravitating toward whatever small group of trusted comrades remained reliably nearby, this smaller, more intimate loyalty, proving more practically important for your own immediate survival than whatever remained of the broader, increasingly theoretical military structure. Amid this retreat's widespread breakdown of ordinary military discipline, one notable exception stood out clearly, even to exhausted, struggling, ordinary soldiers like yourself: the Imperial Guard, particularly its most elite Old Guard units, maintaining remarkably consistent discipline and cohesion throughout even this campaign's most brutal periods. These elite soldiers, carefully selected veterans representing your commander's most trusted military units, continued marching in proper formation, maintaining weapon readiness and following orders with a consistency that stood in stark contrast to the increasingly disorganized, straggling characterizing much of the broader retreating army. You observed these guard units passing at various points during your own difficult march, their continued discipline serving as both genuine inspiration and, if you're honest, a source of some complicated envy, given your own unit's less organized circumstances. This discipline wasn't achieved without cost. Guard units suffered their own significant losses to cold and exhaustion, their elite status providing better initial equipment, but not genuine immunity to this campaign's overwhelming environmental brutality. Yet, their continued cohesion mattered, these disciplined units providing crucial rearguard support during several critical moments, their maintained combat effectiveness helping protect the broader, less organized retreat. You found yourself watching these guard units maintain their composure amid surrounding chaos, drawing some genuine comfort from evidence that military discipline remained achievable even under this campaign's most severe testing conditions. Among the various individual stories of genuine courage and competence that emerged from this brutal retreat, few proved as significant or as widely celebrated as Marshal Ney's leadership of the army's rear guard, the position specifically tasked with protecting the main column from pursuing Russian forces threatening from behind. This assignment represented, by any honest assessment, one of the most dangerous positions within your entire retreating army, rear guard units facing the most persistent, most immediate combat pressure from pursuing Russian regulars and Cossack cavalry alike, while simultaneously suffering the same brutal cold and inadequate supply as every other portion of this desperate retreat. Ney's rearguard fought numerous difficult engagements during this period, repeatedly finding itself dangerously isolated from the main army's protection, forced to fight its way back toward reunification through considerable Russian opposition on several harrowing occasions. Yet Ney's forces persisted, demonstrating remarkable tactical skill and genuine personal courage that earned him widespread admiration even among soldiers who'd grown increasingly cynical about military leadership more broadly during this deteriorating campaign. You heard stories passed back through the marching column via soldiers who'd witnessed these rearguard actions directly, about Ney personally fighting alongside ordinary soldiers rather than directing operations safely from the rear, about his apparent, genuine determination to bring as many of his men through this ordeal as humanly possible. This kind of individual leadership and courage, emerging amid broader institutional collapse and mounting catastrophe, offered a kind of complicated comfort to ordinary soldiers like yourself. Evidence that genuine competence and genuine care for common soldiers' welfare hadn't entirely disappeared, even as the broader campaign's fortunes continued their steady, seemingly unstoppable deterioration. As your army continued its difficult retreat through increasingly desolate countryside, a new, unsettling sound began accompanying your nightly halts. Wolves, drawn by the abundant, tragic supply of the dead and dying, scattered along your army's route. You heard them first at considerable distance, distant howling carried across cold, still night air. But the sounds grew steadily closer and more frequent as the retreat continued, wolves apparently learning quickly that this slow-moving, increasingly weakened column represented a reliable, tragic source of sustenance. Soldiers began reporting direct sightings, gray shapes moving at the tree line's edge during evening halts, sometimes bold enough to approach abandoned equipment or fallen comrades not yet properly buried or removed from the roadside. This presented genuine additional danger. Exhausted, weakened soldiers occasionally falling prey themselves to increasingly bold wolf packs during the coldest, darkest hours of night. You learned to keep fires burning through the night whenever fuel remained available, learned to sleep in closer physical proximity to trusted comrades, partly for warmth, but increasingly also for basic safety against this new opportunistic threat. This wolf presence became, in its own grim way, another small measure of exactly how thoroughly your army's circumstances had deteriorated. A once proud military force now literally hunted by wildlife, drawn to the visible, tragic evidence of its own ongoing collapse. You remember specific nights when the howling seemed to surround your resting position from multiple directions simultaneously, a psychological pressure that made already difficult sleep more elusive. Among this retreat's most difficult aspects involved the fate of soldiers wounded or too exhausted to continue marching under their own power, a category of increasingly desperate circumstance that grew steadily larger as October progressed into November's harsher conditions. Proper medical care, difficult enough to maintain even during this campaign's earlier phases, became practically impossible to sustain during the retreat's mounting chaos. Surgeons and medical supplies overwhelmed by casualties from combat, frostbite, exhaustion, and disease, all simultaneously demanding attention. Wounded soldiers, unable to maintain the army's marching pace, faced brutal, difficult choices, continuing forward through genuine agony in hopes of somehow keeping pace, or falling behind into territory where Cossack cavalry, hostile local peasants, or simple exposure to increasingly severe cold offered little realistic hope of survival. You witnessed, more than once, comrades making the difficult decision to help wounded friends however possible, sharing what limited resources remained, though this compassionate assistance came with its own genuine cost, slowing the helper's own progress and consuming resources that might otherwise have supported their own individual survival chances. Some wounded soldiers were, by necessity, simply left behind when continued movement became impossible, a decision that weighed heavily on comrades forced to make it. You think, even now, about specific individuals you personally witnessed facing this brutal calculation, faces you still remember clearly, despite the considerable time and distance separating you from those specific, difficult moments. Among the countless difficult nights this retreat demanded you endure, one evening remains especially vivid within your memory, worth recounting specifically, rather than simply folding into this broader campaign's general accumulated hardship. You'd found, that night, a small abandoned structure, barely more than a shed, offering marginally better shelter than simply sleeping exposed to open sky. You shared this modest shelter with perhaps a dozen fellow soldiers, strangers from several different units, who'd similarly sought whatever protection this small structure's walls provided. You remember the quality of conversation that developed among this temporary group. Men normally separated by unit loyalty or even nationality, finding genuine common ground, and even occasional dark humor regarding their shared predicament. Someone produced a small amount of remaining alcohol, shared carefully among the group despite its scarcity. Stories were shared, home villages described, family members mentioned with the tenderness soldiers facing genuine mortal danger often develop toward memories of ordinary domestic life. You remember, specifically, an older soldier, more experienced than yourself, offering quiet, practical advice about surviving the specific challenges still likely awaiting your continued retreat. Information shared generously, despite this stranger having no obligation toward your own well-being. That night, cold and difficult as it was, remains fixed within your memory as a moment of genuine human connection amid overwhelming catastrophe. A reminder that even history's most severe collective hardship contains within it countless individual moments of genuine kindness worth remembering. Near the town of Krasny, your army encountered one of this retreat's most costly and dangerous combat episodes. Russian forces under General Kutuzov positioning themselves to strike directly at your increasingly strung-out, vulnerable marching column. The fighting here proved severe. Various corps within your larger army, finding themselves isolated and forced to fight through considerable Russian opposition, simply to maintain their position within the broader retreating column, casualties mounting significantly across several difficult days of engagement. You experienced or witnessed directly the terror of combat conducted under these already brutal circumstances. Soldiers already weakened by hunger, cold, and accumulated exhaustion nonetheless required to fight with whatever remaining strength and discipline they could muster. This engagement further demonstrated your army's increasingly precarious tactical position, strung out across considerable distance, with individual corps vulnerable to concentrated Russian attack whenever terrain or circumstance allowed such concentration to occur effectively. Casualties from Krasny added significantly to your army's already substantial losses, further thinning ranks that had begun this campaign with such overwhelming numerical superiority. You marched onward from Krasny with renewed, sharpened awareness of exactly how dangerous this retreat's remaining distance still promised to be. It's worth briefly considering this campaign's events from the perspective of General Kutuzov, the Russian commander whose strategic patience proved so significant in shaping this campaign's ultimate catastrophic outcome for your own retreating forces. Kutuzov faced considerable domestic political pressure throughout this campaign to engage your forces more directly and more aggressively. Various advisors and officials arguing that decisive, immediate battle would more quickly and more definitively resolve this conflict, rather than his preferred strategy of patient harassment combined with reliance on Russia's own brutal winter conditions. Kutuzov, however, understood something his more aggressive critics apparently didn't fully appreciate. His own forces, while numerically strong, remained vulnerable to the same severe winter conditions afflicting your retreating army, and unnecessary direct combat risked squandering Russian military strength that patient strategy could preserve, while still achieving devastating results against your own increasingly desperate forces. This strategic patience, controversial among his own contemporaries at the time, proved remarkably effective in retrospect, allowing Russian forces to harass and weaken your retreating army, while avoiding the kind of costly direct engagement that might have proven unnecessarily expensive in Russian lives and resources, given how effectively cold and hunger were. Already accomplishing Kutuzov's essential strategic objectives without requiring extensive additional Russian combat risk. You, experiencing this strategy directly as its intended target, understood little of these broader strategic calculations at the time, simply experiencing the practical consequences: persistent harassment, occasional serious combat engagement, but never quite the single decisive battle that might have offered your army either genuine opportunity for meaningful victory or at least a clearer, more immediate resolution to this campaign's mounting uncertainty. Kutuzov's patient strategy, whatever its contemporary critics argued, ultimately proved devastatingly effective, achieving through patient harassment and reliance on environmental brutality outcomes that direct combat alone might never have achieved quite so completely or quite so decisively against your own army's substantial initial strength. As your army continued its difficult retreat, growing awareness spread through the ranks regarding a specific, significant obstacle still awaiting you further along this journey: the Berezina River, a substantial waterway that Russian forces were apparently positioning themselves to use as a decisive trap. You'd heard the river's name mentioned with increasing frequency and increasing apprehension as your retreat continued. Officers and experienced soldiers alike, recognizing that crossing any substantial river under active enemy pressure represented one of warfare's most dangerous tactical challenges. Intelligence, however incomplete, suggested Russian forces under multiple commanders were converging specifically to prevent your safe crossing. Hoping to trap your remaining forces against the river's western bank in a decisive, potentially campaign-ending engagement. This looming threat added genuine new urgency to your retreat's already desperate pace. Soldiers pushing forward with whatever remaining strength they could muster, driven partly by simple hope of reaching and crossing this critical river before Russian forces could fully complete whatever trap they were apparently preparing. You marched with this specific dread now added to your accumulated existing burdens, aware that whatever combination of cold, hunger, and exhaustion had already claimed so many of your original comrades might soon be joined by a more direct, immediate military catastrophe. The Berezina, whatever its actual eventual reality might prove to be, had already become, in the anxious collective imagination of your entire retreating army, this campaign's next, and possibly most decisive, genuine test of survival. When your army finally reached the Berezina's vicinity, a genuine engineering achievement, remarkable given the circumstances, offered your only realistic hope of safely crossing this significant obstacle. French military engineers, working under General Eblé's direction, constructing makeshift bridges at a location called Studianka, working in freezing water to assemble structures capable of supporting your army's continued passage. These engineers performed their extraordinarily difficult, dangerous work under brutal conditions, standing in near-freezing river water for extended periods, racing against both time and Russian forces converging to prevent exactly this crossing from succeeding. You witnessed or heard detailed accounts from those who directly witnessed the genuine heroism these engineers demonstrated, many suffering severe, ultimately fatal complications from their extended exposure to freezing water, sacrificing their own health and often their lives to construct the crossing structures your army's survival depended upon. 2 bridges were eventually completed, one designated primarily for artillery and heavier equipment, another for infantry and lighter traffic, a remarkable engineering accomplishment achieved under combat conditions. You felt, approaching these bridges yourself, a complicated mixture of genuine relief that crossing now seemed physically possible, combined with mounting anxiety about exactly how chaotic and dangerous the actual crossing process itself might prove. The bridges represented hope, genuine and substantial, but hope that would require navigating considerable additional danger and chaos before that hope could translate into actual, successful safety on the river's opposite bank. As word spread that the bridges were finally ready, an immense, desperate crush of soldiers, camp followers, and remaining wagons began converging simultaneously toward the crossing point, creating exactly the kind of chaotic, dangerous congestion that made orderly passage difficult to maintain. You found yourself caught within this immense, pressing crowd. Thousands of desperate individuals all simultaneously attempting to reach and cross these narrow, fragile bridge structures. Discipline and organized military order giving way increasingly to raw, individual survival instinct. The bridges themselves, remarkable engineering achievements though they were, remained fundamentally fragile structures, never designed to support this magnitude of simultaneous crossing pressure, swaying and groaning under the tremendous weight and constant movement of thousands of soldiers, animals, and equipment. You witnessed, during your own crossing, scenes of genuine, desperate chaos, people falling into freezing water when overcrowding caused sections of the crowd to lose footing, others being trampled in the crush as forward momentum made careful, safe movement increasingly difficult to maintain. Officers attempted, with limited genuine success, to maintain some semblance of organized passage, prioritizing military units over the considerable number of civilian camp followers who'd accompanied this campaign. You made your own crossing during this initial period, before the situation deteriorated even further, grateful retrospectively for whatever combination of timing and fortune allowed your own passage before the crossing's later stages grew more catastrophic. Among the considerable crowd attempting the Berezina crossing alongside regular military personnel were substantial numbers of women, some soldiers' wives who'd accompanied this campaign from its earliest stages, others local women who'd attached themselves to the army during various stages of this extended campaign. These women faced this crossing's genuine dangers without any of the official military priority extended, however imperfectly, toward regular soldiers, generally finding themselves pushed toward the crossing's margins amid the desperate, chaotic crush of bodies. You witnessed, during your own crossing, moments of remarkable courage among these women, mothers carrying young children through the crush, wives refusing to abandon injured husbands despite genuine personal risk. Some accounts from this period describe women giving birth during the actual crossing itself, or immediately before or after, an almost unimaginable circumstance given the surrounding chaos, cold, and genuine mortal danger. You think now about these women's courage and resilience, facing this campaign's brutal demands with even fewer institutional resources than ordinary soldiers received, their individual stories largely absent from most subsequent formal military histories. Their presence throughout this campaign and their suffering during this specific crossing deserves acknowledgement alongside the more commonly documented military experience. As the crossing continued across multiple difficult days, Russian artillery began targeting the bridges and the desperate crowd still attempting to cross them, adding direct, immediate combat danger to the already severe hazards of overcrowding, freezing water, and structural strain. You heard, and in some cases directly witnessed, the horror of artillery shells striking directly into the crowded masses still waiting their turn to cross, casualties mounting rapidly among soldiers and civilians alike who had no meaningful way to escape or take cover. This artillery bombardment added genuine urgency and terror to an already desperate situation, soldiers pushing forward with even greater desperate intensity, aware that remaining exposed on the riverbank now carried immediate mortal danger. You witnessed scenes during this period that would remain vividly, permanently disturbing within your memory, long after this campaign's eventual conclusion. The horror of watching fellow soldiers and civilian camp followers, including women and children who'd followed this campaign, caught directly within artillery bombardment while trapped in crowds too dense to allow meaningful evasive movement. The bridges themselves suffered damage from this bombardment, requiring continuous, dangerous repair work from engineers who were themselves increasingly exhausted and increasingly vulnerable to the same artillery fire. You crossed, eventually, successfully, though the memory of what you witnessed during this period remained among the most traumatic memories this entire brutal campaign would eventually leave you carrying forward. Eventually, with Russian forces closing dangerously near, and the bulk of organized military forces having completed their crossing, the difficult, agonizing decision was made to destroy the bridges, preventing pursuing Russian forces from using them while simultaneously, tragically, abandoning whatever remaining soldiers and camp followers hadn't yet managed to complete their own crossing. You witnessed or heard detailed, harrowing accounts from those who directly witnessed the genuine horror of this final decision. Soldiers and civilians still desperately attempting to cross, suddenly finding their path forward, literally burning beneath them, forced into freezing water in a final, often fatal attempt to reach the far bank. This moment represents, in the broader history of this catastrophic retreat, one of its most tragic episodes. Thousands of soldiers and civilians left behind on the river's eastern bank when the bridges were finally destroyed. You think, even now, about the agony this decision must have represented for the commanders forced to make it, weighing the broader army's continued survival against the immediate, visible abandonment of soldiers and civilians who trusted this same army's leadership. Estimates of casualties specifically from this Berezina crossing, including both combat deaths and those who drowned or froze attempting the crossing itself, number in the tens of thousands. A single, concentrated catastrophe within this campaign's already substantial broader toll. You carried this memory forward, alongside everything else this retreat demanded you witness, and somehow survive. The engineers who constructed the Berezina crossing deserve extended acknowledgement beyond their brief earlier mention, their genuine sacrifice representing one of this campaign's most remarkable examples of dedicated service under circumstances offering little realistic hope of personal survival or reward. General Eble's engineering units worked in near-freezing water for extended periods, construction requiring repeated immersion that modern medical understanding would immediately recognize as carrying genuine, severe mortal risk, given the combination of extreme cold water exposure and already compromised physical condition these engineers brought to this demanding task. Many of these engineers, according to subsequent accounts, understood clearly the personal medical risk their work required, choosing to continue regardless, given clear recognition of how many thousands of fellow soldiers' survival depended on their successful completion of this crucial crossing structure. Eble himself reportedly worked alongside his men rather than simply directing operations from safer, drier positions. Personal leadership that helped maintain morale and continued effort despite the brutal physical demands. This specific engineering task required under these severe circumstances. Casualty rates among these engineering units proved severe, many suffering fatal complications from extended cold water exposure, even among those who survived long enough to see their crucial construction work through to actual completion. A sacrifice that saved more lives than it ultimately cost, though this calculation offered little genuine comfort to the specific individuals who paid this severe personal price. You think, having personally benefited from these engineers' remarkable sacrifice during your own crossing, about the moral weight this specific episode carries within this campaign's broader catastrophic narrative. Ordinary men choosing extraordinary personal risk specifically to preserve their fellow soldiers' continued survival, a choice deserving lasting acknowledgement and gratitude from everyone whose own survival this sacrifice ultimately helped make possible. Having crossed the Berezina, your army's numbers had diminished dramatically from whatever remained even before this specific catastrophic crossing, the force now continuing its retreat toward friendlier territory, representing merely a fraction of the 600,000 men who'd confidently crossed into Russia months earlier. You marched now among fewer familiar faces. The accumulated losses from combat, cold, hunger, and this specific river crossing, having claimed comrades you'd shared considerable hardship alongside across these difficult preceding weeks. Their absence now a constant, quiet presence within your own continued march forward. The remaining distance toward genuine safety still stretched further. Weeks more of difficult marching through worsening winter conditions before your diminished forces might reach territory where this campaign's brutal demands could finally, meaningfully ease. You found yourself marching in this reduced, diminished column, developing a kind of numbed, exhausted resilience, having witnessed and survived enough genuine horror during these preceding weeks that continued forward movement had become almost automatic. Russian pursuit continued, though with somewhat reduced intensity following the Berezina crossing's costly engagement. Russian forces themselves having suffered their own significant losses and logistical strain during this extended campaign. You continued marching, one difficult step following another, driven now less by any remaining hope and more by simple, stubborn persistence. Some days after crossing the Berezina, your small group encountered a sudden, brief, but terrifying skirmish with Cossack cavalry, an incident that stands out even amid this campaign's numerous other dangerous encounters as a moment when your own personal survival felt particularly immediately uncertain. You'd fallen slightly behind your main column, exhausted and struggling to maintain pace, when Cossack riders suddenly appeared from nearby tree line. Your small group, perhaps 8 or 9 exhausted soldiers, found ourselves suddenly required to form whatever hasty defensive position our depleted strength allowed. The engagement itself lasted only minutes, though it felt longer, adrenaline temporarily overriding the deep exhaustion that had characterized your body's baseline state for weeks. You remember firing your musket with hands so cold you could barely properly feel the trigger. 2 soldiers from your small group didn't survive this brief encounter. The remaining survivors, yourself included, managed to hold long enough that the Cossacks eventually withdrew back toward the tree line as suddenly as they'd initially appeared. You remember the shaking that overtook your body once immediate danger passed, adrenaline draining away and leaving you acutely aware of exactly how close this brief, violent encounter had come to claiming your own life. You buried what you could and continued marching, carrying this specific memory forward as one among many close encounters with mortality. In the weeks following the Berezina crossing, temperatures fell to levels that made every previous cold your army had already endured seem, in retrospect, almost mild by comparison. Conditions cold enough to kill exposed soldiers within hours rather than the days or weeks earlier, less severe cold had generally required. You witnessed, during this period, the horror of frostbite's rapid, severe progression, exposed skin, blackening and dying within remarkably short exposure periods, soldiers losing fingers, toes, ears, and in severe cases, entire limbs to cold, intense enough to freeze living tissue solid within minutes. Simply stopping to rest became dangerous during this period. Soldiers who sat down exhausted, sometimes failing to rise again, cold working with exhaustion to produce a kind of fatal drowsiness that claimed lives quietly, without dramatic incident. You developed, alongside every surviving comrade around you, an intense, constant vigilance against exactly this danger, forcing yourself and encouraging others to keep moving, keep talking, keep any form of activity going that might prevent the fatal drowsiness. This extreme cold seemed specifically designed to induce. Fires became almost impossibly precious during this period. Adequate fuel, increasingly scarce across countryside, already stripped bare. Soldiers competing, sometimes violently, for whatever warming opportunity any available fire offered. You survived this period through some combination of remaining physical resilience, sheer stubborn determination, and simple fortune, aware throughout that countless comrades around you, no less determined or deserving of survival, simply succumbed to cold this severe despite their own genuine, desperate efforts to continue. In early December, with your remaining forces finally approaching safer territory, word spread through the diminished ranks that your commander himself had departed the army, traveling ahead rapidly toward Paris, leaving Marshal Murat in overall command of whatever forces remained. This decision, controversial then and remaining debated among historians ever since, reflected genuine strategic calculation. Growing political instability back in France required the emperor's direct, immediate attention, and remaining with the army's slower, continued retreat offered little additional strategic benefit once the campaign's essential catastrophic outcome had become undeniably clear. You felt, hearing this news alongside your fellow surviving soldiers, a complicated mixture of reactions, some feeling genuine abandonment at their commander's departure, others recognizing the practical political necessity driving this decision. Still others simply too exhausted to spare much emotional energy for processing this development. Your commander's departure didn't meaningfully change your own immediate circumstances. The same brutal cold, the same persistent hunger, the same difficult remaining distance toward genuine safety, continuing regardless of exactly who held nominal overall command. You continued marching under Murat's continued leadership. Whatever complicated feelings his predecessor's departure had initially generated, gradually subsumed beneath the same overwhelming, immediate priority. Simply continuing forward, one difficult step at a time, toward whatever safety might still await you. The final stretch of this retreat toward the city of Vilnius and the relative safety it represented tested whatever remaining resilience your severely diminished, exhausted forces still possessed. Cold and exhaustion continuing their relentless toll even as genuine safety grew tantalizingly, increasingly closer. You marched through this final difficult stretch alongside a fraction of your original comrades, faces you'd shared this entire brutal journey alongside now conspicuously, permanently absent, their fate ranging from combat death to cold, to capture, to simple disappearance during this retreat's countless, difficult, chaotic days. Vilnius itself, when your remaining forces finally reached it, offered welcome but limited relief. The city's own resources strained by the sudden arrival of thousands of exhausted, desperate soldiers requiring immediate food, shelter, and medical attention. You felt, arriving finally in friendlier territory, an overwhelming mixture of relief and delayed, accumulated grief, safety finally achieved, but at a cost that felt processed now, with whatever mental clarity, exhaustion still permitted, almost incomprehensibly severe given the confident, celebratory mood that had characterized this campaign's original beginning back in June. You allowed yourself, for the first time in what felt like longer than the actual weeks involved, genuine rest without immediate fear of cold, hunger, or pursuing Russian forces, your body and mind both beginning the difficult, gradual process of processing everything this brutal campaign had demanded you witness and somehow survive. In the weeks and months following your army's eventual return to friendlier territory, the full, staggering scale of this campaign's losses gradually became clear. Historians and military officials alike attempting to properly account for exactly how catastrophic this Russian campaign had proven to be. The exact totals vary according to which supporting armies and reinforcements are counted, yet the conclusion does not. Of the hundreds of thousands committed to the invasion, only a small fraction returned in organized ranks. It remains one of the most catastrophic military campaigns in European history. These numbers, staggering as bare statistics, represented individually hundreds of thousands of personal stories. Men who died in combat, men who'd frozen to death during the retreat's brutal final weeks, men who'd starved, men who'd drowned at the Berezina, men captured by Russian forces, men who simply vanished into this vast, unforgiving landscape. You think about this now, having personally survived circumstances that claimed so many equally capable, equally determined comrades, aware that survival itself often depended on factors barely distinguishable from simple chance, timing, or fortune, rather than any skill or virtue. Military historians would spend considerable subsequent time analyzing exactly what combination of decisions, circumstances, and simple bad fortune produced this catastrophic outcome, debates that continue occupying serious historical attention, even centuries after this campaign's actual conclusion. For you personally, these careful historical debates matter less than the simple, overwhelming fact of having survived something that claimed so many others. Beyond the broader historical and statistical accounting of this campaign's catastrophic losses, individual survivors like yourself carried forward more personal, harder to quantify consequences from everything this brutal retreat had demanded you witness and endure. Physical consequences remained obvious and immediate for many survivors. Frostbite damage, sometimes severe enough to require amputation. Chronic health complications from prolonged malnutrition and extreme cold exposure. Psychological consequences, though less immediately visible, proved equally significant for many survivors. Persistent difficulty processing the genuine horror witnessed during this campaign's most brutal episodes, particularly the Berezina crossing's catastrophic scenes of mass casualty and desperate, chaotic suffering. You found yourself, in the months following this campaign's conclusion, experiencing your own version of these lingering effects. Certain sounds or sensations unexpectedly returning you mentally to specific, difficult moments from this brutal retreat. Relationships with fellow survivors took on significance during this period. A shared understanding among those who'd endured this same brutal experience that civilians simply couldn't fully appreciate or properly understand. You carried forward, alongside these considerable personal costs, a kind of hard-won perspective regarding ordinary daily comfort and security, an inability to entirely take for granted the basic warmth, food, and safety that civilians around you continued experiencing as simply unremarkable features of ordinary daily life. This campaign's catastrophic outcome would go on to occupy a significant place within broader European historical memory, frequently cited as a definitive demonstration of how thoroughly environmental and logistical factors could overwhelm even history's most successful, most seemingly unstoppable military commanders. Military historians and strategists, studying this campaign extensively, would identify numerous specific lessons. The genuine danger of extending supply lines too far beyond reliable resupply capability, the critical importance of adequate winter preparation, the vulnerability created when retreat becomes necessary later in the season than originally planned. You, personally, understood these lessons not as abstract military theory but as lived, brutal experience, having witnessed directly exactly how devastatingly these theoretical logistical failures translated into actual, individual human suffering and death. This campaign's broader historical significance extended well beyond simple military lesson learning, marking a genuine, significant turning point in your commander's broader political and military position across Europe, the beginning of a decline that would eventually culminate in his complete political downfall within just a few additional years. You think about this broader historical significance sometimes, aware that you personally lived through and survived a campaign that historians would eventually study for centuries, though your own immediate, lived experience felt less like participating in significant history and more like simple, desperate, moment-to-moment survival. Beyond its immediate catastrophic human cost, this campaign's broader consequences rippled outward across European politics and military strategy for years following its actual conclusion, consequences that gradually became clear even as you personally focused primarily on your own individual recovery. Your commander's aura of practical invincibility, carefully cultivated across a decade of successful campaigns, suffered severe, arguably irreparable damage from this catastrophic defeat. Other European powers who'd previously hesitated to directly challenge his continued dominance, now recognizing genuine vulnerability they hadn't previously believed existed. Subsequent military campaigns would follow, other European powers increasingly willing to challenge French dominance directly, emboldened partly by this campaign's clear demonstration that even history's most successful military commander remained vulnerable. You witnessed, in the years following your own personal survival of this campaign, the gradual unfolding of these broader political consequences, additional wars, eventually culminating in your commander's complete political downfall and exile. For ordinary soldiers like yourself who'd personally survived this campaign's brutal demands, these broader political consequences mattered less than your own immediate personal recovery and gradual return to whatever ordinary civilian life remained available to you. In the years following this campaign's actual conclusion, numerous survivors, officers, and ordinary soldiers alike eventually produced written accounts and memoirs, attempting to properly document and process everything this brutal experience had required them to witness and endure. These various accounts, considered collectively, offer historians remarkably rich, detailed source material regarding this campaign's actual lived experience, supplementing official military records with the kind of genuine personal detail and emotional authenticity that formal reports typically couldn't adequately capture or convey. You yourself, in the years following your own return, considered occasionally whether to produce your own written account. Weighing the genuine therapeutic value some survivors reported finding through this process against your own uncertain comfort, with fully revisiting and documenting this campaign's most difficult, most disturbing specific memories. Many survivors reported finding genuine value in this process, writing, serving as a way to properly process and eventually achieve some measure of psychological resolution regarding experiences that otherwise remain difficult to fully integrate into their ongoing post-war lives and identities. These various memoirs, taken together, would eventually provide raw material for countless subsequent historical studies, novels, and other cultural works attempting to properly understand and communicate this campaign's genuine historical significance and human cost to audiences removed from direct personal experience of anything remotely similar. You consider now this broader documentary legacy this generation of survivors eventually created, individual acts of memory and testimony gradually accumulating into the substantial historical record subsequent generations would rely upon to properly understand exactly what this catastrophic campaign demanded from the ordinary soldiers who lived through and so often didn't survive its brutal historical unfolding. Beyond the military personnel whose experiences have dominated most historical accounts of this catastrophic campaign, considerable civilian suffering accompanied this entire brutal episode, suffering that deserves acknowledgement even within an account primarily focused on your own personal military experience. Russian civilians across the territories your army traversed experienced their own severe hardship. Villages destroyed or stripped of resources by both advancing and retreating armies. Agricultural production disrupted across an entire growing season. Camp followers, the considerable number of civilians, including women and children, who'd accompanied this campaign for various personal reasons, suffered their own severe hardship throughout this retreat, experiencing many of the same brutal conditions, while generally possessing even fewer resources and even less institutional support. You witnessed, during various points throughout this retreat, the additional vulnerability these civilian followers experienced. Lacking military training, lacking official supply allocation, often lacking adequate clothing or equipment. Local Russian populations, too, experienced complicated, difficult circumstances throughout this campaign, some assisting retreating French forces out of simple humanitarian compassion despite obvious risk. Others, understandably, showing less sympathy toward invading forces. You think now about this broader circle of suffering extending well beyond your own personal military experience, a reminder that historical catastrophes of this magnitude rarely confine their genuine human cost neatly within whatever official military categories subsequent historical accounts typically emphasize. Amid this campaign's overwhelming brutality and catastrophic losses, you experienced and witnessed others experiencing occasional moments of genuine human kindness and mutual support that stood out with vividness precisely because of the surrounding, overwhelming hardship. You remember specific comrades who shared their own limited food when your own supplies ran completely out, expecting nothing in return beyond whatever similar support you might eventually offer them during their own future moments of need. Some local Russian civilians, despite obvious reason for hostility toward invading forces, occasionally offered food, shelter, or basic assistance to individual soldiers or small groups, acts of humanitarian compassion that transcended the broader national conflict. You witnessed officers sharing their own somewhat better provisions with ordinary soldiers under their command, medical personnel continuing to provide whatever care remained possible despite completely overwhelmed resources, engineers risking and sometimes losing their own lives, constructing the Berezina crossing that saved so many others. These moments of genuine kindness didn't erase or excuse this campaign's overwhelming catastrophic suffering, but they offered, even in retrospect, some genuine comfort regarding human capacity for compassion and mutual support, even during humanity's most severely testing circumstances. You carry these memories forward with special care, aware that they represent something important about human nature and human resilience. Reflecting now, from whatever distance, time, and continued safety eventually provide, on exactly what factors distinguished those who survived this brutal campaign from those who didn't, you find yourself recognizing a complicated combination of factors rather than any single, simple explanatory pattern. Physical resilience mattered, certainly, though even remarkably strong. Healthy soldiers sometimes succumb to this campaign's brutal demands, while others with less obvious physical advantage somehow managed to survive. Practical adaptability proved significant. Soldiers willing to abandon rigid expectations about acceptable food or proper military formality, generally faring better than those who struggled to adjust. Social connection mattered enormously. Soldiers maintaining strong bonds with trusted comrades, generally surviving at higher rates than those who found themselves increasingly isolated. Mutual support and shared resources providing genuine, practical, and psychological advantage. Simple fortune, uncomfortable as this acknowledgement remains, played an undeniable role that no amount of skill, preparation, or virtue could entirely overcome. You find yourself, considering this complicated combination of factors, feeling neither excessive pride regarding your own survival, nor excessive guilt regarding comrades who didn't survive, recognizing instead the genuine complexity and significant role of simple chance. Among this campaign's countless individual stories of suffering and endurance, the relatively small number of horses that survived this entire brutal ordeal deserve their own acknowledgement. Animals that endured circumstances nearly as severe as those affecting their human companions throughout this catastrophic retreat. These surviving horses, fewer than the numbers that had originally crossed into Russia, generally belonged to officers or served particularly crucial functions that justified extraordinary effort toward their continued preservation, despite the severe general shortage of adequate forage and shelter affecting all animals. Throughout this campaign's brutal demand, you witnessed soldiers and officers making remarkable efforts to preserve their own horses' survival, sharing their own limited food rations, constructing makeshift shelter using whatever materials remained available, recognizing clearly how significantly their own continued mobility and effectiveness depended on these animals' continued survival alongside their own. These surviving horses, by the campaign's eventual conclusion, showed obvious signs of their own severe ordeal, visibly thin, coats rough and damaged, yet remarkably still functional, still capable of providing their crucial transportation and cavalry support, despite having endured privation nearly as severe as that affecting the human soldiers who'd worked so hard to preserve their survival. You think, considering these surviving animals alongside your own human survival, about the bond that developed between soldiers and their horses during this shared ordeal, a relationship deepened by mutual reliance and shared suffering that peacetime service, however dedicated, rarely produces with quite this same intensity and depth of genuine mutual dependence. Among the many comrades whose fate you witnessed directly during this campaign's brutal demands, one friendship deserves specific, personal acknowledgement. A bond formed during this campaign's early, confident weeks that ended, like so many others, amid this retreat's overwhelming catastrophe. You'd known this comrade since your unit's initial formation, shared training, shared the confident optimism characterizing this campaign's early stages, shared countless ordinary daily moments that friendship during military campaigning naturally produces. He'd remained beside you through much of this retreat's early difficulties, sharing food when either of you had surplus, offering encouragement during particularly difficult stretches, maintaining something resembling genuine good humor, even as circumstances grew increasingly desperate. His decline, when it finally came, proved gradual rather than sudden, exhaustion and cold slowly overwhelming his physical resilience, despite his own evident determination to continue matching your pace. Eventually, despite your genuine efforts, he simply couldn't continue. Sitting down at the roadside during one particularly brutal stretch, insisting you continue without him rather than risk your own survival, attempting further assistance that circumstances made increasingly futile. You carry this specific loss forward with weight. Distinct from this campaign's broader statistical catastrophe, a genuine personal grief for a specific friend whose absence you still notice, even now, safely returned home. Throughout this campaign's brutal demands, maintaining whatever communication remained possible with family back home provided both comfort and considerable additional emotional complexity for soldiers like yourself, attempting to convey experiences that felt, even while writing about them, almost impossible to properly communicate. You attempted, during whatever brief opportunities allowed actual letter writing, to convey some honest sense of your circumstances without unnecessarily alarming family members who could offer no practical assistance regardless of how much they might worry. This created its own emotional burden, balancing honest communication against protective instinct toward family members' own emotional well-being. Many soldiers, including yourself, settling on somewhat sanitized accounts. Mail delivery itself proved unreliable throughout this campaign's most difficult periods, letters sent during the retreat's worst weeks, sometimes never reaching their intended recipients. You think now about family members back home during this campaign's worst weeks, receiving increasingly worried, increasingly incomplete information about a catastrophic military campaign whose actual severity exceeded whatever official reports had managed to adequately convey. Reuniting eventually with family members who'd endured their own considerable anxiety during your absence provided its own complicated emotional experience. Genuine joy at reunion mixing with awareness of how thoroughly this campaign's experience had changed you. When you finally returned home following this campaign's conclusion, family members who'd anxiously awaited your return noticed, almost immediately, changes in your demeanor and behavior that even your own attempts at reassuring, sanitized communication during the campaign itself hadn't adequately prepared them to properly expect. You'd grown noticeably thinner, of course, an obvious physical consequence family members had perhaps anticipated given whatever incomplete information about this campaign's genuine hardship had reached them. But subtler changes proved more difficult for both yourself and your family to properly navigate. You startled more easily than previously, sudden sounds or unexpected movement triggering immediate, involuntary defensive reactions that felt entirely disproportionate to whatever ordinary domestic circumstance had caused them. You found yourself eating with unusual, almost anxious thoroughness, finishing every available portion regardless of genuine hunger, old habits from genuine scarcity, proving difficult to immediately release, even once reliable, abundant food became available again. Sleep itself proved complicated during this initial return period. Your body and mind still calibrated toward the heightened vigilance this campaign's genuine dangers had required. Genuine rest requiring considerable time and patient effort to properly re-establish as circumstances that no longer demanded constant defensive alertness. Family members responded with varying degrees of patience and understanding. some intuitively recognizing that time and gentle patience would prove more helpful than direct questioning about experiences you weren't yet ready to fully discuss. Others, perhaps, struggling more visibly with your altered demeanor and occasional emotional distance during this difficult initial readjustment period. You appreciated, eventually, whatever patient understanding family members managed to extend during this complicated transition, recognizing retrospectively how difficult properly supporting a returning survivor's gradual reintegration must have proven for people who'd had no direct, comparable experience of their own to draw upon in understanding your circumstances. In the time since this campaign's actual conclusion, you've noticed ways this experience has permanently altered your perspective and daily awareness. Changes that persist, regardless of how much time and distance now separate you from this campaign's actual brutal events. Ordinary warmth, the simple comfort of adequate shelter and reliable heating during cold weather, no longer feels like an unremarkable, expected feature of daily existence, but rather registers, consciously and gratefully, as a genuine, precious achievement. Food, similarly, carries different weight now, adequate, reliable meals registering with a gratitude that people who haven't experienced genuine, severe hunger generally don't quite share. You notice yourself too, appreciating ordinary, unremarkable social connection differently. Ordinary conversations with friends and family, carrying value given your direct experience of this campaign's severe isolation and eventual catastrophic losses among comrades. Winter itself, previously simply an unremarkable seasonal change, now carries emotional weight. Cold weather, sometimes, triggering unexpected vivid memories of this campaign's most brutal periods. You've come to accept these permanent changes as simply part of your ongoing experience, neither entirely burden nor entirely gift, but rather a complicated, permanent reshaping of perspective. Your own specific unit, which had crossed into Russia back in June, with several hundred men, in reasonably good order and confident spirits, eventually reassembled, once genuine safety was finally achieved, as a smaller, more subdued group than its original proud formation had ever suggested, might become necessary. You remember the quiet moment when your surviving unit members were finally counted and accounted for, officers reading names from original muster rolls, each unanswered name representing another comrade whose fate, whether death, capture, or simple disappearance, remained now simply another statistic within this campaign's overwhelming broader catastrophe. Fewer than a quarter of your original unit's strength remained to answer that final roll call, a proportion that felt, even having personally lived through and somewhat anticipated this outcome given everything you'd witnessed, still shocking when finally confirmed through this specific, personal accounting rather than simply abstract, broader campaign statistics. You recognized faces among the survivors. Men you'd shared this entire brutal ordeal alongside. Relief at their continued survival, mixing with grief regarding the larger number of familiar faces now permanently absent from this diminished, quiet gathering. This moment of final accounting felt, in its own way, more significant than any of the broader campaign's dramatic individual episodes. A quiet, Simple confirmation of exactly how catastrophically this campaign had reshaped your own immediate military community. Friends and comrades reduced to a fraction of their original number through combined combat, cold, hunger, and simple, exhausted collapse. There's a quality to genuine peace and safety once you've personally experienced their catastrophic absence, a depth of appreciation that people who haven't shared similar severe experience generally can't quite fully replicate. You've learned, through this campaign's brutal demands, to appreciate genuine stillness and quiet in ways you hadn't previously considered particularly significant. The simple absence of immediate danger, immediate hunger, and immediate severe cold registering now as genuine, substantial gifts. This appreciation extends into your understanding of rest itself. Sleep no longer feeling like simply an automatic, unremarkable biological necessity, but rather registering as a genuine privilege, particularly meaningful, given your direct experience of this campaign's periods, when sleep itself carried genuine mortal danger through cold-induced, potentially fatal drowsiness. You find yourself settling now into whatever comfortable rest current circumstances allow, experiencing a gratitude for exactly this kind of safe, warm, restful sleep. This appreciation doesn't erase or diminish whatever genuine trauma and loss this campaign's brutal demands imposed upon you and countless fellow survivors. But it does offer a complicated gift alongside that trauma, a depth of gratitude for ordinary safety and comfort that many people fortunate enough never to have experienced similar severe catastrophe simply never develop with quite this same intensity. Following your eventual return home and whatever period of physical and psychological recovery proved necessary, you faced the challenge of returning to ordinary civilian work and daily routine, a transition that proved more complicated than you might have anticipated. Ordinary daily tasks, the kind of unremarkable work and routine that had characterized your life before this campaign began, felt, initially, strangely difficult to properly re-engage with. Your mind and body both still calibrated toward the extreme, constant vigilance this campaign's brutal demands had required. You found yourself, during this transition period, sometimes overreacting to minor, ordinary difficulties, a delayed shipment, or a minor financial setback, triggering disproportionate anxiety given your mind's continued calibration towards severe circumstances. Colleagues and family members, understandably, sometimes struggled to fully understand this altered perspective. Well-meaning attempts at sympathy occasionally falling short, given the genuine difficulty of properly conveying this campaign's actual severity. Gradually, though, with time and patient effort, you did manage to reintegrate into ordinary civilian routine, your extreme wartime vigilance slowly easing into something more sustainable, though never entirely disappearing. You consider this transition, even now, one of this campaign's less commonly discussed but significant lasting consequences: the practical challenge of resuming ordinary life after experiencing circumstances so far removed from ordinary civilian existence. As you settle now toward whatever rest tonight's reflection has been building toward, you find yourself considering what specifically, from this entire brutal campaign's experience, feels most worth carrying forward and properly remembering. Not simply the horror, though that horror deserves honest acknowledgement rather than convenient forgetting. Not simply the statistics, staggering and historically significant though they are, but something more personal. The specific comrades who shared what little they had, the engineers who sacrificed their own lives, constructing crossings that saved countless others, the persistent, stubborn human determination to continue forward. You think about Marshal Ney's genuine courage commanding that brutal rear guard, about ordinary soldiers sharing food with hungry comrades, about local Russian civilians who occasionally offered compassion despite obvious reason for hostility, about the resilience that allowed you personally to survive. This campaign taught you, through direct, brutal experience, exactly how fragile ordinary comfort and safety prove to be, and exactly how much genuine value exists within simple, ordinary, daily existence. You carry this knowledge forward now, not as a simple burden, but as a hard-won form of wisdom regarding what matters within ordinary daily life. Tonight, having walked back through this entire brutal campaign's experience, from Moscow's burning skyline through the Berezina's catastrophic crossing to this eventual hard-won safety, you find yourself finally ready to set down, at least for tonight, the accumulated weight of everything this reflection has required you to remember. You think, one final time, about the sheer scale of what this campaign cost. Hundreds of thousands of lives, an empire's fortunes permanently altered. Countless individual stories of suffering and occasional remarkable courage. You think, too, about your own personal survival, achieved through some complicated combination of physical resilience, practical adaptability, meaningful social connection, and simple, undeniable fortune. None of this feels, even now, fully resolved or fully understood, the way catastrophic historical experiences rarely offer neat, complete resolution. But you feel, nonetheless, ready now to rest, the accumulated weight of tonight's extensive reflection finally beginning to ease, replaced gradually by simple, grateful awareness of your own current safety, warmth, and continued existence. As sleep finally begins properly claiming you tonight, your last clear thoughts return, gently now rather than urgently, to the lessons this brutal campaign's experience has permanently taught you about survival, gratitude, and the genuine fragility underlying ordinary daily comfort and safety. You think about warmth, no longer simply assumed but actively, consciously appreciated. You think about food, no longer merely consumed but valued. You think about safety itself, no longer an unremarkable background condition but a precious, actively appreciated gift. You think, too, about the comrades who didn't survive alongside you, holding their memory gently rather than with overwhelming grief, understanding that properly honoring their sacrifice means living your own continued life with genuine appreciation and presence. Tonight, you're warm. Tonight, you're fed. Tonight, you're safe and completely, in ways that would have seemed almost unimaginably precious during this campaign's most brutal periods. Close your eyes. Let the cold remain simply a memory now, distant and gradually softening, rather than an active, immediate threat demanding your continued vigilance. Let whatever remains of tonight's reflection settle gently into rest rather than continued urgent processing. And sleep, the way only someone who's directly experienced how precious and how precarious safe, warm rest proves to be, can properly, gratefully allow themselves to sleep deeply and completely tonight.